You were taught to look for a purpose, as if you were looking for a job, as if there were a secret position waiting for you in the world, with a clear description, emotional benefits, and promises of personal fulfillment. This idea, repeated endlessly in self-help books and motivational speeches, is comfortable, seductive, and completely false. Because purpose is not a prize you find out there after much effort. It's not a magical calling that suddenly reveals itself, like finding a $100 bill in an old pair of jeans. Purpose isn't written in a sacred book. It's not in catchphrases. It's not in your diploma, your talent, or your life mission you copied from someone on Instagram. Purpose is not an answer. It is a consequence. And Carl Jung was one of the few men who dared to say this out loud. The self-help industry, billion-dollar, greedy, glowing with easy promises, turned human suffering into marketing. It took the existential anguish of millions of lost people and packaged it into 7-step techniques, slogans, and colorful maps to find your why. But Jung said something brutal. The soul is not moved by techniques. The soul is moved by symbols, and symbols are not formulas. They are living forces, unconscious, archetypal. As long as you keep searching for your purpose with the rational mind, like someone hunting for a career label or a passion that pays, you'll only find frustration. Because real purpose is not a choice, it's a revelation, and it only appears when you have the courage to face what you avoid the most, yourself. The idea that you'll find your purpose like finding a Wi-Fi password is childish. It's comfortable, but it's a disservice to the complexity of the soul. Because before wanting a purpose, you must become someone capable of holding one. And that only happens after collapse, after sleepless nights, after destroyed relationships, broken identities, and an ego screaming, "I don't know who I am anymore." It is in this moment that something new can be born, not when you're motivated or inspired or full of borrowed certainties. True purpose emerges from emptiness, from honest despair, from the internal confession that you don't know where you're going, but for the first time, you don't want to fake it anymore. And in that raw, silent space where no ready-made phrase can enter, that's where the self begins to speak. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you are. And here's the hard truth. You don't begin this path when you find purpose. You begin it when you lose all the false ones, when your career no longer makes sense, when the relationship ends, when your body gets sick, when you realize you've spent your entire life trying to play roles, meet expectations, and chase validation. And even after doing everything right, you still feel empty. That's not failure. That's the beginning, the sign that the ego is surrendering, and that the true self, the one you've never heard because you were too busy trying to succeed, will finally have space to breathe. The greatest trap of self-help is this, making you believe you're in control of your destiny, when in truth, you're just running further away from what you feel. Jung said, "What you avoid governs your life," and most people avoid silence, pain, and doubt. But those are precisely the 3 doors that lead to a real encounter with purpose. Because purpose is not what excites you, it's what devours you. It pulls you inward, breaks you open, disorganizes you, and by doing so, reveals you. And that kind of path doesn't fit in an Instagram post or a motivational speech. It belongs to a journey, painful, lonely, brutal, and absolutely necessary. If you still believe you'll find your purpose by reading one more self-help book or taking another personality test, then this video is not for you. But if there is, deep in your chest, a silent sensation that something far deeper is trying to emerge, even if you can't name it yet, then maybe now is the time. Time to throw out all the formulas, to forget everything they told you success was, and to begin listening to what you've silenced until now. Not to become someone, but to become whole. Maybe you've looked around in recent days and thought, I don't know who I am anymore, I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do with my life. And the most desperate feeling isn't the lack of direction. It's the silence that follows that question. A silence that no one answers. Not religion, not your friends, not quick therapy, not productivity hacks. And that's where the most brutal and most liberating truth of Jungian psychology lies. You're not lost. You're broken inside, fragmented, divided, in conflict. And until you gather the pieces of your soul scattered along the path, purpose will never find you, no matter how hard you chase it. Carl Jung didn't call this a lack of direction. He called it the disintegration of the psyche. And that disintegration happens because throughout life, you've shaped yourself in order to survive. You were taught to be functional, likable, adaptable. You were taught to silence your anger, hide your sadness, disguise your fear. You were rewarded for being too strong and punished for being too vulnerable. And so, without realizing it, you began to rip pieces out of yourself and show only what the world would accept. Jung called this the persona, the character you present to the world. But the problem begins when you start to believe that this character is who you truly are, and then one day the soul sends the bill through anxiety, through emptiness, through the terrifying sense that nothing makes sense anymore. You're not lost, you've just drifted away from yourself. It's as if your soul stopped at a crossroads, and your ego kept speeding down a road toward a vision of success that was never truly yours. And the farther you run, the more disconnected you feel, more anxious, more out of place. And no matter how much you achieve, plan, or strategize, everything feels hollow, because no external result can fill the void left by the parts of yourself you've abandoned. You became a specialist in goals, but a stranger to your own soul. Jung said that the psyche is like an underground city, full of forgotten streets, sealed houses, dark basements, and purpose doesn't arise on the brightly lit avenues of consciousness, but in the shadowy alleys of the unconscious. This means you won't find meaning in life while trying to organize yourself. It's not about more discipline, more focus, more routine. It's about gathering pieces, reconnecting with the child you once were, facing the traumas you pretended to forget, naming the emotions you've numbed, and above all realizing that the pain you feel today is not failure, it's a calling. Existential emptiness, in Jung's view, is not a problem to be fixed, it's a portal to be crossed. The ego believes confusion is a sign of error, but to the soul, confusion is a sign of transition. When you feel like you no longer fit into the life you built, it's because the old you is dying, and the new one hasn't been born yet. It's an inner birth, and birth hurts. It bleeds, it isolates, but it also sets you free. And true purpose can only manifest, when the new you is whole enough to hold it. There's no point in chasing meaning if you're still craving acceptance. There's no point in seeking purpose if you still seek approval. Because purpose is not light, it's not comfortable. It demands truth, it demands courage, it demands that you abandon the version of yourself that the world applauds, to discover the one your soul is begging to become. That's why the first step isn't to search, it's to acknowledge that you are in pieces. And this fragmentation, no matter how painful, is sacred because it marks the beginning of return. The moment when you stop running and begin to listen. The moment when the ego falls silent and the soul finally speaks, not with words, but with sensations, dreams, symbols, tears. The true encounter with purpose begins when you dare to touch what you've spent a lifetime avoiding. The darkness, the doubt, the formless, because it is there and only there that your truth resides. If you feel lost, listen. You're just too far from yourself. But everything can change, not when you find the right answer, but when you stop running from the question. You believe you're making decisions based on logic, that your choices are conscious, that your path is the result of your own will. But Jung throws a bucket of cold water on that belief. The unconscious governs your life, and until you face it, it will keep dragging you down roads you don't understand. Worse, it will make you repeat patterns, sabotage relationships, create crises, and then leave you feeling like it's all your fault. But it's not your fault. It's the fault of your ignorance toward the force behind it all, the unconscious. And if you still think this is some kind of mystical nonsense, understand this. It's the foundation of depth psychology. To ignore it is to keep living in the dark. The unconscious is not a black hole. It's an active, symbolic, organized, and extremely intelligent system. It records everything you repress, everything you avoid, everything you experienced but never processed. Childhood memories you can't recall, emotions you pretended to forget, desires you locked away in shame. All of it is still alive. And more than that, all of it is still acting. In the subtext of what you say, in the dreams you don't understand, in the people you attract, in the decisions you make without knowing why. The unconscious is like an invisible screenwriter scripting your story while you believe you're the author. Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And that's exactly what happens. You think it's bad luck, karma, misfortune in love, poor career choices, that you just have a magnet for problems. But in truth, it's your unconscious begging to be seen. And when you don't listen, it screams. It collapses your business, wrecks your relationship, sabotages your health. Not to punish you, but to wake you up. To say, hey, there's a part of you you've locked in the basement, and it's alive, and until you go down there, your life will keep breaking up here. That's why purpose doesn't arise from, what do I want to do with my life, but from, why do I keep doing what's destroying me? The unconscious guides you through patterns, and patterns are not coincidence. They are repetitions with a lesson still unlearned. Have you noticed how you keep attracting the same kind of person? How you always sabotage what you wanted most? How your greatest fears end up coming true? That's not misfortune. It's your unconscious repeating the script until you find the courage to change the character. True freedom begins when you stop trying to control the world and start listening to what the world is trying to show you about yourself. Jung called this the symbolic listening to life. Every crisis has a symbol. Every repetition has a code. Every collapse holds a message. But you only decode it when you abandon the shallow gaze and begin to see with depth. And that doesn't happen with self-help books or motivational quotes. It happens with silence, with analysis, with confrontation, with dissent. Because true purpose only appears when you clear the channel through which it can emerge. And that channel is your relationship with the unconscious. And how do you begin to see what's hidden? With the courage to listen, with humility to admit you don't know who you are, with the willingness to revisit your story, without the victim filter, without the strongman mask, without the urgency of productivity. The unconscious doesn't reveal itself to those who want quick answers. It reveals itself to those who can withstand hearing what they've avoided for a lifetime. Because when you listen to your pain without judgment, it becomes direction. And that is the beginning of purpose. You are not in control, but you can start seeing who is. And when you do, maybe for the first time in a long while, you'll feel something you'd forgotten existed. Clarity. Not because everything makes sense, but because you finally stopped running from yourself. You grew up learning what worked, what pleased others, what brought acceptance. You discovered still a child that when you smiled more than you felt, you were praised. When you hid your pain, you were called strong. When you adapted, you were rewarded with belonging. And so, without realizing it, you created a mask, an armor of appearances, built from pieces of what others expected from you. Carl Jung called this mask the persona. And it is, at the same time, your greatest protection and your most silent prison. Because while the world applauds the version of you that fits the mold, your soul dies slowly, suffocated inside a role. The persona isn't fake, it's functional. It helped you survive in environments where being authentic was dangerous. It was the face you had to wear to fit in at school, in your family, at work, in society. That's why it shouldn't be rejected, but understood. The problem begins when you forget it's a mask, when you mistake it for your identity, when you become so good at the role you created that you start to believe that's all you are. And then, when someone says you're so confident, you smile on the outside, but inside, a voice whispers, if only they knew the fear I'm hiding. Purpose never shows up for a character because the character doesn't feel, doesn't listen, doesn't break down. It only performs. And purpose is not performance, it's essence. But the persona doesn't care about your essence. It wants control. It wants the likes, the compliments. It wants to be admired, not to be real. And the longer you live inside it, the further you get from yourself. That's why so many people collapse at the peak of success, because they built castles on top of a mask. And when the castle falls, there's no ground left, just the echo of emptiness. Jung said the persona is necessary, but temporary. It's like a garment you wear to go outside, but must take off when you come home. The problem is, most people no longer have an inner home. They are trapped in the character 24/7, trying to look like someone they're not, trying to maintain an image they no longer even understand. And this creates a brutal dissonance, because while the world recognizes your persona, no one sees your pain, no one sees your exhaustion, no one sees that you are tired of upholding something you can no longer bear to live. The rupture begins when you have the courage to disobey the role, to stop meeting expectations, to let the mask fall, even if it costs you compliments, even if it costs you applause, even if it costs you relationships, because the price of being false is too high. And what's at stake is not your image, it's your soul. True purpose only emerges when the persona begins to crumble, when the world says, "You've changed," and you respond, "Finally," when you lose people, but find pieces of yourself, when you stop performing and start feeling. But beware, when the persona falls, pain surfaces, because with it fall the defenses too. The ego trembles, shame rises, the fear of judgment explodes, and that's why so few walk this path to the end. But if you can endure this passage, if you can look in the mirror without the mask, if you have the courage to meet what lives behind the praise, then, and only then, the real begins to emerge. And it won't be pretty, or polished, or marketable, but it will be yours, entirely yours. And that is worth more than any form of recognition. Carl Jung said that the function of the persona was to facilitate your relationship with the world, but the function of the soul is to facilitate your relationship with meaning, and one cannot replace the other. If you want to find your purpose, the first step is to take off the mask, even if no one recognizes your true face, because it is that face that came into the world with a destiny, not the character they invented for you. You spent your life trying to be good, proper, controlled, civilized. You did everything you could to show your prettiest, most functional, most acceptable side, and everything that didn't fit that mold, anger, envy, jealousy, fear, selfishness, pain, you swept under the rug. You hid it, buried it, pretended it wasn't yours, but everything you bury stays alive, and worse, it grows in the dark. Carl Jung called this psychological basement the shadow, and he said that it doesn't disappear when ignored, it grows stronger. And the more you pretend there's no darkness inside you, the more it runs your life from the sidelines, without you even realizing it. And as long as that happens, true purpose remains locked away, because it can only be born when you reconcile with everything you tried to erase. The shadow is everything you don't want to be, but are everything you deny. Everything you condemn in others, everything you judge as unacceptable, everything you say, "I'd never be like that." But you would. You already have, or you are, in secret. And that's exactly where the power lies. Because the shadow isn't only made of evil, trauma, or shame. It's made of vital energy, of powerful parts of your soul that were repressed so you could fit into the world. Jung said the shadow is the negative personal unconscious, but that it also holds forgotten treasures. And integrating the shadow is recovering lost wholeness. It's making peace with your most human, untamed, and real side. Most people live in war with their own shadow. They either project it onto others, hating what they can't stand in themselves, or repress it and end up imploding from within. But the truth is simple. Everything you avoid controls you. Everything you repress returns. Everything you don't integrate sabotages your life. And purpose? Purpose is hidden right there. Because what you came here to do isn't found in your good side. It's in the encounter between your light and your darkness. And only those who can face their own pain without fleeing are able to carry a purpose worth living for. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's the key. You don't become free by getting more positive. You become free when you stop running from what you feel. When you stop pretending everything's fine. When you stop trying to be spiritual before being honest, because only truth has the power to heal. And your truth lies where you're most afraid to go. It's in those memories you never told anyone. In that trauma you pretended to overcome. In that rage you shoved in the drawer. In that desire you judged as ugly. But it is those exact contents, those very ones, that carry the seed of your calling. The process of integrating the shadow is brutal. It's lonely, it's uncomfortable, it's a descent into the underworld within. But it is also the beginning of a new life. Because when you look at what you avoided, feel what you numbed, accept what you rejected, something changes, something aligns inside, as if the pieces finally begin to fit, as if, for the first time, you stop fighting yourself and start walking in the same direction, no longer your ego trying to win on one side and your soul pulling the other way. It's alignment. A reunion, a union of opposites, and only then does purpose appear, when you stop being a battlefield and become fertile ground. As long as you don't face the shadow, it will keep sabotaging everything that matters. It will poison your relationships, destroy your peace, block your clarity. But when you have the courage to go down into the basement and listen to what it has to say, you'll see it's not your enemy, it's your forgotten part. And when that part is integrated, you'll discover a truth that changes everything. What you avoided the most was exactly what you needed to become whole. You try to keep everything under control, your job, your relationship, the image others have of you, your plans, your goals, your routines. You strive, organize, plan, adapt. You do what's right, what's expected, what seems safe, until one day, everything breaks, without warning, without explanation. Suddenly, what felt solid collapses. The person who loved you leaves. The career that once defined you loses meaning. Your body gets sick. Fear explodes. And there you are in the rubble asking, "Why is this happening to me?" That's when Carl Jung enters with the answer no one wants to hear, but everyone needs. Chaos is the soul's first call. It's not punishment. It's a summons. It's the unconscious shaking you awake for something greater. Jung said the ego must break for the self to emerge. And that is one of the harshest and most liberating truths of depth psychology, because the ego is rigid, linear, controlling. It craves predictability, stability, routine. But the self wants expansion, wholeness, It wants you to live who you truly are, not who you learn to appear to be. And for that to happen, the old structure must collapse. And it won't collapse with pretty words or more motivation. It collapses through pain, through loss, through confusion, through breakdowns that seem unfair, but deep down are necessary, because the soul doesn't lead you straight to the light. It drags you into the dark, and that's where you're reborn. You may be going through exactly that right now. A phase where nothing makes sense, where everything slips through your fingers, where the answers are gone, where the ground has turned to fog. Jung called this moment the dark night of the soul, a period where the old self can no longer sustain life, but the new self hasn't yet been born. It's an in-between space, a sacred emptiness, a fertile collapse. And it's exactly in that space that purpose begins to form, because only in the silence of chaos can you hear what's been ignored for so long. The body, the intuition, the dreams, the symptoms, the signs, all that the noise of control used to silence now begins to speak. Collapse is the language of the unconscious when the ego won't listen, and it speaks through symbols, through accidents that interrupt your rush, through illness that forces you to stop, through breakups that reveal the lie you pretended to believe, through failures that expose your fragility. None of this is random. The soul uses chaos as a tool, as a mechanism of revelation, because as long as everything is working, you question nothing. But when everything breaks, you're forced to look. And what you see may be devastating, but also liberating, because there, amid the wreckage, you find what you've ignored your whole life, your truth. And what's the mistake people make when they enter chaos? Trying to get out too quickly, trying to fix, to solve, to return to how things were. But Jung said, what you resist persists, and the chaos you run from will visit again, in a different form, with a different name, with a different pain, until you accept it, until you stop, until you listen, because chaos doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to transform you, to dismantle the false structure so the real one can be born, to show you that the meaning you were looking for outside was always buried underneath the image you built. Chaos is ground zero, the symbolic womb, the space where nothing is, but everything can be. And it's there, exactly there, that purpose begins to take form, not as an idea, not as an answer, but as a feeling, a calling, a pulse of life from within, a voice that whispers, you don't need to pretend anymore. And when you hear that, when you allow everything to collapse without rushing, without explaining, without running, purpose appears, fragile at first, but true. And everything that is true with time becomes sacred. So if your life is falling apart, listen. This is not the end, it's the beginning. It's the moment when the old you dies, so that the new you at last can be born. You were taught to believe that everything depends on your choices, that if you just think positively, plan, set goals, and work hard, you can become anything. That idea sells books, fills auditoriums, feeds egos, but it's an illusion, a trap of the ego that believes it's the center of the universe. Carl Jung dismantles this fantasy with a single, brutal truth. Purpose is not something you choose with your mind. It's something that chooses you through your soul. And that choice doesn't come through comfort. It comes through a calling, through pain, through the feeling that even when everything seems to be in place, something inside you is begging for truth. Purpose is not a rational decision. It's not about choosing between being a doctor or an artist, between building a business or serving others. It doesn't reveal itself in a career plan or a market analysis. It doesn't obey logic or trends. Purpose is wild, archetypal, mysterious. It's a force that rises from the unconscious and takes form in your life as a deep desire, a chronic unrest, a persistent sense of incompleteness. It begins as an absence, as a symbolic wound, and only later reveals itself as a path. And if you're too distracted trying to make it work, you may never hear that silent summons and live an entire life far from yourself, surrounded by achievements that feel empty. Jung affirmed that purpose is not born from the ego, but from the Sihuak self, the archetypal center of the psyche. And the self is a mystery. It doesn't explain itself. It manifests through dreams, through synchronicities, through sudden losses, through inexplicable fascinations. You think you chose to study that subject, to pursue that work, to meet that person, but when you look deeply, you realize you were drawn, pulled, as if something greater was pushing you down a path you don't fully understand, but that somehow has always been written inside you. The problem is that the ego wants control. It wants a purpose that fits into your life plan, that brings approval, income, stability. It wants something that sounds good on LinkedIn and around the holiday dinner table. But real purpose doesn't follow those rules. It disrupts. It breaks the script. It demands rupture. The self doesn't care if you'll be successful. It wants to know if you'll be a whole. And sometimes, to be whole, you'll have to leave the comfort zone, disappoint expectations, lose status, and shatter certainties. Because truth is not born from convenience. It's born from courage. The soul doesn't speak in clear sentences. It speaks in symbols, and purpose is one of them. It shows up in what moves you for no reason, in the talents you're ashamed to show, in the causes that stir something deep inside you, in the pains that keep repeating, in the themes that have followed you since you were a child. None of that is random. They are signs, invitations, fragments of the personal myth only you can live. Because no one else holds the map that is hidden inside you, and that map doesn't reveal itself quickly or through formulas. It reveals itself when you silence the ego and listen to the call. You won't find your purpose through online quizzes, or talking to coaches, or reading yet another success book. You'll find it when you stop looking outside and start feeling inside. When you accept that maybe you don't know what to do, but you do know what you can't keep pretending. When you stop chasing safety and start following what makes your soul tremble. Because purpose isn't an answer, it's a surrender. And it's not you who chooses it. It chooses you. But only when you're ready to hold it with truth. Jung said that individuation is the process of becoming who you are, and purpose is the trail the self leaves along that journey. It's not about inventing a mission, but about accepting the call that's already guiding you, even if you don't know how to name it yet. You think you're a unique person, that your feelings are yours, your choices are yours, your dramas are one of a kind. But what if I told you that you are acting out a story that has been told thousands of times by other people in other cultures with different names? Carl Jung called these internal stories archetypes, universal patterns of the human psyche that live within the collective unconscious and manifest in you without your awareness. They shape your desires, your fears, your passions, your downfalls. And that's why you connect so deeply with movies, books, ancient myths. Because you're not just watching characters, you're seeing parts of yourself. Archetypes are like symbolic programs, deep codes that live inside all of us. They're not ideas, they're living forms, psychic forces that activate behaviors, emotions, and inner paths. More than that, they're maps of purpose, because each archetype represents a stage in your inner journey. When you feel the need to save everyone, the "I hero" archetype is active. When you feel betrayed by those you trusted most, the orphan chital is rising. When you begin to question everything, seek meaning and break from the old world, the seeker, or the rebellion, is taking over. And when you start to touch others with what you've learned, to heal with your presence, to guide with your transformed pain, the sage, the healer, the master is being born. Jung didn't invent the archetypes, he identified them. They've always existed. In fairy tales, Greek tragedies, sacred texts, Netflix series, the names, the costumes, the settings change, but the psychic drama is the same. Because the human soul is made of the same substance, and it moves through the same cycles. You live archetypal conflicts every day, but call them personal problems. You feel archetypal anguish, but label it anxiety. You repeat archetypal patterns, but call it bad luck. And as long as you don't realize you're inside a myth, you'll keep being its victim instead of becoming its protagonist. Individuation, the path to true purpose, is in truth the traversal through these archetypes. It's like a symbolic game where you must face each inner character, listen to what it has to teach you, learn from it, and move forward. If you avoid one, it retaliates. If you cling to one, it imprisons you. The hero who won't stop fighting becomes a martyr. The caregiver who forgets themselves becomes codependent. The explorer who never roots becomes a fugitive. The lover who lives only for the other loses themselves. Every archetype, when unbalanced, turns into shadow, but when integrated, becomes power. Your purpose isn't in a fixed destination. It lies in how you move through the archetypes that live within you. Each one holds a key, a lesson, an aspect of the self waiting to emerge. And when you begin to recognize them, everything changes. You stop blaming yourself, stop judging your story. You start to see there's a larger design, that your pain has context, that your journey has structure. You're not lost, you're being guided from within by something far older than your biography, by a myth that only you can embody, but that lives in everyone. And here is the central point. When you integrate an archetype, you gain potency. You claim an inner energy that had been dormant. And in that moment, purpose ceases to be a search and becomes an expression. You no longer need to seek what you came here to do. You begin to be, to live, to embody, and the world responds. Because the universe recognizes when someone is aligned with their personal myth and delivers what's needed, not to reward you, but to push you even deeper into the path of truth. The archetypes live in you, but would you live consciously in them? Or are you simply being pulled by inner forces you haven't yet named? Jung would say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Purpose begins when you realize you are not just you. You are the stage of an archetypal play, and it's time to step into your role with awareness. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why, even surrounded by people, goals, and accomplishments, you still feel a void in your chest? Why even after meeting every expectation, something essential still feels missing? Jung answered this question with one of the most profound ideas in modern psychology: individuation. Not as an intellectual concept, but as a vital process, an existential crossing. Individuation is not about being special. It's not about standing out. It's about becoming who you truly are. Not what the world wants, not what your family projected, not what your ego idealized, but what lives at your core, what has always been there, waiting to be set free. Individuation is the opposite of blind adaptation. It's the opposite of fitting in. While the ego craves belonging, the soul longs for expression, and that conflict is at the root of almost all human suffering. Most people live to be accepted, and because of that, they are never become. They repeat patterns, copy models, perform personas. They build an entire life based on what works for others. And even when they succeed, even when they reach visible achievements, they feel a kind of exhaustion that isn't physical, it's existential. They feel alive, but not present, aware, but not whole. To individuate is to walk against the grain of the world and toward the direction of your soul. It's diving into unconscious material, confronting the shadow, rescuing the self, integrating opposites. It's not an easy path. It's long, painful, and offers no guarantees. You'll have to unlearn everything you thought you were. You'll have to shed masks, face traumas, abandon roles. You'll lose relationships, status, comfort zones, because there is no individuation without rupture, and there is no birth without symbolic death. The caterpillar must cease to exist for the butterfly to emerge, and that hurts, but it also sets you free. Jung said that individuation is the purpose of human life, not a philosophical luxury, but a soulful urgency. Because as long as you haven't become who you are, you live divided, in conflict, like a puzzle piece that never fits. And all that inner noise, that chronic anxiety, they're not diseases, they're symptoms of a denied truth. The truth that you were born with a unique code, with a personal myth, with a symbolic path only you can walk. And every time you betray it to fit in, a part of you dies on the inside. Purpose, therefore, is not the starting point. It's the result. The result of becoming whole, of walking through chaos, of confronting the unconscious, of reconciling with everything in yourself that was rejected. Purpose is not a goal, it's a consequence. It doesn't come by force, it emerges. When you stop trying to become someone and start listening to who's always been inside. And what emerges isn't a career, a mission, or a plan. What emerges is a presence, a clarity, a silent alignment between what you feel, what you think, and what you live. And when that happens, you know. Not because someone told you, but because you feel truly alive. To individuate is to embody your own soul. It's to stop existing on autopilot and begin to live with radical awareness. It's to stop being part of the crowd and start being part of yourself. It's to leave the surface and dive into the fertile abyss of the unconscious. It's to stop seeking meaning and start being meaning. It's to die many times and be reborn each time with more truth. And those who make that journey never go back, because once you've tasted wholeness, you'll never again settle for fragmentation. Carl Jung said no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is individuation, the act of descending into the inner hell to retrieve the spark of your being. And when that spark returns, purpose is no longer a desperate search. It becomes a silent certainty, an axis, a center, an invisible thread running through everything you live, giving meaning even to pain. Because now pain is no longer failure. It's formation. It's refinement. It's the sign that you are finally becoming who you came here to be. You keep searching in your job, in relationships, in courses, in videos, in gurus, in travel, in goals, in anything that, for a few moments, makes life feel meaningful. But soon the emptiness returns, the restlessness comes back, that whispering anguish says, this still isn't it. And without knowing why, you begin the search again. Another degree, another job, another project, another relationship. Another distraction, another desperate attempt to fill something that always seems to be missing. And Jung looks at you silently and says, you will not find outside what only exists within. The greatest trap of modern life is the externalization of meaning. We are taught to seek outside everything that, in truth, can only be found within. We search for love, but don't love ourselves. We chase recognition, but don't recognize ourselves. We run after purpose, but never stop to listen to the soul. We're always moving, always producing, always comparing, but completely disconnected from the center. And that center is not an idea, it's a direct experience, an inner axis, a living presence. And it only appears when all the noise goes quiet. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He knew the unconscious holds the key to everything the ego seeks in vain. Because the ego wants control, clarity, objectives. The soul, however, wants integration, presence, wholeness, and wholeness cannot be found outside. It is revealed within, and only to those with the courage to dive deep, to face their own abyss, to abandon urgency, outcomes, and performance. Because the self, the core of being, does not respond to demands. It only speaks when the ego goes silent. And it speaks in symbols, in dreams, in unexplained emotions, in breakdowns, in silences, in symptoms. Everything you try to avoid is exactly what points the way back home. The problem is, we've been trained to avoid silence. Silence is frightening. It removes control. And without control, the ego panics. But it's only in silence that truth appears. And it's only when you allow yourself to stop seeking, stop trying, stop pretending, that what's real can finally emerge. And what emerges might not be pretty. It might be pain. It might be rage. It might be grief. It might be confusion, but it's truth, and truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the beginning of freedom. Jung said the soul is not interested in what you show, but in what you hide, not in what you achieve, but in what you avoid. And as long as you keep trying to find yourself in the world's display windows, you will keep drifting further from who you are. Because the world may offer stimulation, distraction, even recognition, but never meaning. Meaning is an internal seed. It's like a flame you must protect from the external wind, and it only grows when you nurture it in silence, with patience, with surrender, with deep listening. And here's the brutal turning point. Everything you're searching for is already in you. The clarity, the strength, the calling, the answer, all of it. But it's buried beneath layers upon layers of conditioning, fear, trauma, expectation. It's not that you need to acquire purpose. You need to clear the path to it. You need to shed the masks, unlock the pain, loosen the persona, dive into the shadow. And in the midst of that process, almost imperceptibly, purpose begins to appear. Not as a shout, but as a whisper. Not as a promise, but as a direction. You will continue to feel incomplete as long as you insist on looking outside for what has always been a calling inward. You will stay exhausted as long as you keep fleeing from yourself. You will remain lost as long as you ignore the silent compass that exists at the center of your soul. And it doesn't point outward, it points inward, always inward. Carl Jung taught that the true encounter with the self requires surrender, requires letting go, requires a symbolic descent into the inner cave, because deep inside, in the place you've most avoided, lies what you most need to find: yourself, whole. Every night, as you sleep, something extraordinary happens. Your rational mind shuts down. The noise of the day fades, logic falls asleep, and in that exact moment the soul speaks. Yes, it speaks. Not in words, but in images, in symbols, in strange, intense, absurd storylines, in scenes you try to forget upon waking because they seem chaotic, nonsensical. But Jung gives us a powerful warning. Dreams are letters written by the self to the ego. And you, most likely, are tearing up those letters every single day without realizing it. Ignoring sacred messages, disregarding profound invitations for transformation. Jung dedicated a large part of his life to the study of dreams, and he didn't see them as nonsense from the unconscious or mystical predictions. He saw them as living manifestations of the soul, trying to communicate with consciousness. Every dream, according to Jung, carries psychic content that must be integrated. It might be a forgotten part of you, an unresolved trauma, a repressed intuition, a buried desire, a shadow longing to be seen. A dream is like a symbolic play staged by your own soul to teach you something your waking mind cannot hear. So why do we ignore them? Because we've been trained to prioritize the rational, to believe only in what is logical, linear, measurable, to trust the plan, the method, the strategy. But the soul doesn't work that way. The soul moves in circles, in metaphors, in archetypal imagery. It doesn't hand out ready-made answers. It gives you symbols to decipher, and as long as you treat your dreams as random noise, you will remain blind to half of yourself. Dreams reveal what consciousness cannot bear to face. They expose denied desires, suffocated truths, forgotten potentials. They expose the traps you've built for yourself. They reveal where you're truly heading, even if you tell yourself otherwise. And most importantly, dreams don't lie. They show with symbolic brutality your inner truth. And when you learn to decode them, you discover a map, a script, a hidden compass pointing toward the purpose your ego so desperately chases in vain. Do you dream of labyrinths? You're lost, falling. Your ego is collapsing. Children, a forgotten part longs to be born. Houses, your psyche is asking for reorganization. Death, a cycle within you is seeking closure. Nothing is literal, everything is symbolic. And it's within that symbolism that the gold lies. Because when you interpret a dream deeply, you are listening to the soul. You stop walking in the dark. You begin to realize that, even while sleeping, you are being guided. Jung said, dreams are the most faithful inner counselors. They show what the world cannot show, and often they show what you don't want to see. That's why they're uncomfortable, but also why they're so powerful. Because where there's discomfort, there is growth. Where there's strangeness, there is revelation. Where there is a symbol, there is a path. And the real purpose, the one that cannot be contained in tidy phrases, is built precisely there, in the silent listening of what the self is trying to say. Do you write down your dreams? Do you dive into them? Or do you wake up and forget them as if they were nothing? Jung would see that as a tragic waste, because every dream is a chance to recover a lost part, to integrate what was buried in the unconscious, to align your outer life with your inner truth. That's why often the dream comes before the collapse. It warns, it foreshadows, it offers a chance. And those who listen transform before the pain has to scream. You want purpose? Then start listening to what you dream. Start translating the symbols. Start treating your unconscious as a teacher, not as nighttime garbage. Because when you learn to walk alongside your dreams, you begin to live awake with far more awareness, and that changes everything. Have you ever experienced that strange moment? A coincidence so absurd, so precise, that it felt orchestrated by something beyond logic? You think of someone, and they call you. You walk into a bookstore, and a book falls in front of you with exactly the phrase you needed. You're in the middle of a deep dilemma, and a random song plays with lyrics that seem written for your soul. You might call it chance, luck, coincidence, but Carl Jung called it synchronicity, and revealed that behind these seemingly random events, there is a deep field of meaning. Synchronicity is one of the most mystical and most revolutionary ideas in Jungian psychology. It breaks the notion of mechanical causality and introduces a new way of understanding reality. Events that are connected not by cause, but by meaning. That is, not because one caused the other, but because both belong to the same symbolic field that resonates with the internal state of your soul. It's as if the outer world were mirroring something pulsing within you and offering through events, clues, confirmations, messages. The self does not speak with words. It speaks through events that carry soul. But there's a key detail. Synchronicity does not happen to those who live on autopilot. It requires presence. It requires listening. It requires you to be connected with the invisible, to look beyond the surface, to accept that life is more than matter, logic, and schedules. That's why so many people are surrounded by signs, yet see none, because they're numb, rushed, drowning in control. Synchronicity is subtle, symbolic, delicate. It only reveals itself to those with eyes to see and hearts to hear. And when you learn to recognize it, your life shifts. Jung experienced this firsthand. One of the most famous cases involved a deeply rational patient who rejected anything that wasn't logical. During a session, she described a dream about a golden scarab, a symbol of transformation, and at that exact moment, a nearly identical beetle tapped on the window of the office, a rare, unlikely species. And there it was, the symbol of the unconscious manifesting in the external world, not as proof, but as confirmation. Jung opened the window, caught the insect, and said, "Here is your beetle," what no argument had been able to unlock. Synchronicity blew wide open. These events aren't magical in the mystical sense. They are magical in the symbolic sense. They show that there is an intelligence behind life, an invisible architecture, a dance between the inner and outer worlds. And once again, purpose is not born from control, but from attunement with this greater field. Synchronicity appears as confirmation of alignment. When you're on the path of the soul, the world begins to respond. People appear, opportunities open, doors close with surgical precision. Life begins to conspire, not in favor of your ego, but in favor of your wholeness. But be careful. Synchronicity is not superstition. It's not about seeing signs in everything. It's a refined listening, a kind of symbolic awareness that understands not everything can be explained, but everything can be heard. And when you align with that, you begin to live with a new sensation, the sense that you're being guided, no longer pushed by anxiety, but pulled by intuition. And it's in that frequency that purpose reveals itself, not as a goal, but as a dance with the invisible. So if you're noticing patterns, coincidences, strange repetitions, stop, listen, observe, breathe. Ask yourself, what is this trying to show me? Maybe the self is trying to speak, and if you learn to listen, not with your intellect but with your soul, you'll discover something that changes everything. You were never alone, never lost. You just weren't paying attention. You wake up early, get dressed, face the traffic, endure a routine that drains your energy, and at the end of the month, you receive a paycheck that barely compensates for the emptiness you feel. At night, you scroll through social media and see people saying they work with what they love, that they live their purpose, that they've turned passion into profession. You feel a mix of envy, disbelief, and frustration. And deep down, a question hits you with force. Will I spend my whole life trading my time for money without ever touching something that truly matters? If Jung were alive today, he would look at this collective anguish and say, "You are seeking meaning in a place built only for survival." Modern life has created a brutal chasm between what brings profit and what feeds the soul. And that's where most people are trapped. You were trained to see work as a means to pay bills, buy security, gain status, but you were never taught to see work as an extension of your soul. And that's why you live divided, doing what you must to get by, while silently dreaming of what you would do if you were free. But don't be fooled. This inner conflict comes with a cost. It drains your vitality. It depletes your creativity. It steals the light from your eyes, because no soul can endure being reduced to a cog for too long. Jung never romanticized work, but he knew there's an abyssal difference between functional work and soulful work. The first pays bills, the second reveals who you are. The first consumes, the second nourishes. The first is done outwardly, the second comes from within. And no, it's not about dropping everything to live off art in a mountain cabin. It's about aligning what you do with who you are. It doesn't matter if you're an engineer, a therapist, a cook, a designer. What matters is, does what you do connect you with your essence or push you further away from it? This dilemma isn't new, but it's become unbearable in the 21st century. There have never been so many people depressed with stability, so many unhappy with high salaries, So many screaming inside while smiling in meetings. That's because work today occupies more than half of our conscious lives. And if that half is disconnected from the soul, the whole life gets sick. The soul doesn't negotiate. It endures for a while, but then it demands, through anxiety, through insomnia, through apathy, through identity crises, through a kind of exhaustion no vacation can cure. Because the tiredness doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from feeling too little. And here's the turning point. You don't need to choose between money or meaning, but you do need to stop believing that only money matters. Jung said that true purpose emerges from individuation, and individuation demands coherence between being and doing. If what you do every day betrays who you are, then it's not just your profession that's at risk, it's your soul. And worse, the betrayal becomes habit. You grow used to the disconnection, and before you realize, you've forgotten what you loved, forgotten what moved you, forgotten who you were before becoming a machine. So how do you break free? Start small. Listen to your intuition. Notice what moves you, what you do even without recognition, what makes you lose track of time, what feels like yours, even if the world sees no value in it. The soul doesn't speak in numbers, it speaks in passion, in fascination, in presence. And when you start following that thread even slowly, something changes. Life stops being just resistance and begins to pulse. Purpose, then, is not a perfect profession. It's a state of coherence between what you feel and what you offer to the world. And from that, money follows, not as a reward, but as a consequence. Because the world values, even unconsciously, those who are whole in what they do, who aren't just doing tasks, but embodying meaning. And today, meaning is the rarest commodity of all. Carl Jung wouldn't speak of following your passion with naive optimism. He'd speak of integrating soul and function, of leaving survival behind and beginning to exist, because when what you do starts to reflect who you are, work stops being a burden and becomes a path. You spend your life trying to hide your pain. You camouflage traumas. You disguise failures. You make an effort to appear strong, well-adjusted, put together. You learn to place bandages over wounds that never healed and move on as if they weren't still there, pulsing silently. But Carl Jung revealed a truth that turns everything upside down. It is exactly where it hurts that your purpose begins to take form. Because the soul doesn't awaken through success, glory, or perfection. It awakens through failure, fracture, collapse. Through that pain, you've done everything to forget, and which, for that very reason, holds the key to your calling. Jung said that every complex, that is, every unconscious emotional core that sabotages or controls you, holds at its origin an unintegrated wound. It might have been rejection in childhood, emotional abandonment, betrayal, grief, abuse, humiliation. And around that wound, you built defenses. You became hardened, anxious, controlling, perfectionist, cynical. But what you didn't realize is that, in trying to bury that pain, you also buried for a vital piece of your soul. Because your pain is not just a scar, it is a passage, a seed, a symbolic portal to a sense of life that only you can embody. There is no purpose without a wound, because what broke you is also what can guide you. What you lacked made you sensitive. What hurt you taught you how to listen. What you were denied, you learned to give. The deepest souls are not the happiest. They are the ones who walked through hell and came back with something true to share. And purpose is exactly that, offering the world what only you could transform. Not because you became an expert, but because you became a witness, because you felt it in your flesh, because you bled from within. And those who bleed for real know exactly where others hurt. Modern culture teaches you to hide your pain or to turn it into self-pity. But Jung teaches you to transmute it, to dive into it, go through layers of denial, resentment, and escape, until you find at the center of the wound a calling. It's not quick, not pretty, not comfortable, but it's real. And only in the real can purpose be born. Because purpose is not an idea you invent. It is a force that emerges from something you've lived so intensely, so brutally, so truthfully, that it transformed you forever. Do you feel guilt, abandonment, fear, anger, emptiness? Good. That means you have raw material. You have emotional substance to forge meaning. What's missing is the courage to stop running from it and start listening to what that pain is trying to say, because it's leading you to a place within yourself you've never visited. And there, in that place, lies something only you can discover: your symbolic function in the world, your authentic contribution, that which doesn't come from degrees or talents, but from wounds turned into medicine. Jung didn't romanticize suffering. He saw it as an inevitable passage, not as punishment, but as provocation, as a symbolic baptism. And he said that the soul becomes sick when the wound is ignored, but it blossoms when the wound is faced, when it's told, when it becomes a bridge, not a prison. And this act of turning pain into language, trauma into presence, lack into offering, is the birth of purpose. Not the kind sold in coaching courses, but the kind that holds even in chaos. Because it was born from chaos. Because it is bigger than you. If you want to find your purpose, stop looking at what makes you proud and start diving into what hurts you, because what you hide the most is exactly what the world most needs you to transform. You believe you're deciding your own life, that your choices are the result of your freedom, that the path you're following is yours and no one else's. But Jung, with surgical precision, dismantles this illusion and reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. Most of what you call choice is merely unconscious repetition. Repetition of emotional patterns, of inherited beliefs, of unresolved traumas, of invisible loyalties to your parents' stories. And until you see this with brutal honesty, you'll keep calling freedom what is really just disguised obedience. Jung said that the personal unconscious, the one that holds your life experiences, is shaped by the family unconscious. In other words, your psyche doesn't begin with you. It is a psychic continuation of everything that came before. Your father, your mother, your grandparents, their pain, their failures, their silences, the way they dealt with money, affection, abandonment, power, fear, all of that was internalized. And on some level, you repeat it. Not because you want to, but because you haven't yet seen it. That's what the unconscious does. It repeats what hasn't been healed. Maybe you're in a career that doesn't fulfill you, but that honors your father's expectations. Maybe you're in a cold marriage, but one that mirrors the resilient model your mother endured. Maybe you're unable to say no, because you learned that love means self-erasure. Maybe you're afraid to thrive, because deep down you believe being too happy would betray your parents' suffering. These invisible bonds tie you with a force you don't fully grasp, and that's why you call it destiny. But it's not destiny. It's unconscious repetition. The process of individuation, in Jung's view, demands rupture, a symbolic separation from the family matrix. It's not about rejecting your parents. It's about no longer carrying what was never yours. It's about breaking cycles, returning pain, questioning loyalties, because as long as you live to protect the past, you'll never create the future. You might change cities, professions, partners, but if you don't change inside, the pattern continues. Only the scenery shifts, because what's driving your life isn't the outer world, it's the inner script. And that script needs to be rewritten. True purpose can only emerge when you stop being a copy, when you abandon repetition, when you mourn your childhood, not with sadness, but with psychic liberation. And this process is deep, it's painful, because it means recognizing that you were shaped by stories you didn't choose. It means admitting that, For a long time, your decisions were conditioned, but it also means something profound, the chance to choose for real for the first time. When you start identifying the family patterns you've been repeating, something shifts. What was once automatic becomes conscious. What was once compulsion becomes clarity, and clarity is the beginning of freedom. It's that moment when you look at your story and say, I honor what came before, but I no longer need to repeat it. And in that moment, something new can be born, something that doesn't come from duty or guilt or blind loyalty, but from an inner center that finally detaches from inherited stories and begins to write its own. Jung said there is no individuation without separation, and there is no true purpose while you're still living under the weight of other people's destinies. Because what the soul wants is not to repeat, it is to integrate. And integration demands discernment, courage, and a kind of love so mature it knows that to truly honor your parents, sometimes you must go where they couldn't and stay there, whole. You want to know what's going to happen. You want guarantees. You want to be sure you're on the right path, that your decisions will work out, that your life will make sense. You want control, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's what the ego does. The ego organizes, structures, protects. It builds walls so you don't collapse. It sets goals so you don't get lost. It creates narratives so you feel like someone. But Jung makes it clear, all of this is temporary. All of it is just shell, because the soul doesn't seek safety. The soul seeks truth. And truth, more often than not, is the opposite of control. Most of your suffering is born from the clash between these two internal forces. On one side, the ego, fearful, practical, ambitious, demanding, rule-driven. On the other, the soul, deep, wild, intuitive, symbolic, free. The ego wants you to climb ladders, to achieve, to be rewarded, to be recognized. But the soul wants you to dive, to feel, to listen, to surrender. And while the ego wants to grow outward, the soul wants to descend inward. And that descent requires letting go of the map and surrendering to mystery. Jung said the ego must be strong enough to surrender, and that sounds paradoxical, but it's the key. Because this is not about killing the ego, as some spiritual paths suggest. It's about putting it in its rightful place. The ego is useful, but it cannot be king. It can manage your schedule, but not your destiny. It can plan, but it cannot dictate what you feel, because when the ego rules alone, the soul withers. And when the soul is ignored, life begins to scream. And how does that scream show up? Through emptiness, through apathy, through chronic irritation, existential anxiety, physical symptoms that no one can explain, disturbing dreams, repeating relationships, collapses that feel unfair. The ego says, this is a problem. The soul says, this is a sign. But the ego doesn't want to listen. It wants to fix, it wants to regain control. And the more it pushes, the more the soul withdraws, until one day it explodes. And what explodes isn't the world, it's you from the inside. Purpose is not born from control, it is born from surrender. From that moment when the ego admits it doesn't know, that it can't handle it, that it doesn't understand, and that confession, which the ego fears as death, is, in fact, the beginning of real life. It's when you stop trying to explain and start listening, stop trying to achieve and start inhabiting, stop chasing ideals and begin approaching the essential. Because truth, unlike control, doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be felt. And what is the truth of your soul? Maybe you don't know yet. Maybe it's buried under layers of expectation, fear, conditioning, but it's there, and it whispers in your discomforts, in your passions, in your silences, in your inner conflicts. In those moments when everything seems fine, but you feel out of place. And when you start listening to that call, something shifts. Anxiety softens, urgency fades, because you begin to realize you don't need to pretend anymore. Jung reminds us that the soul has its own rhythm. It isn't linear, it isn't predictable, it doesn't follow goals. It is cyclical, organic, symbolic, and trusting it takes courage, the courage to give up control in exchange for truth. And once touched, that truth is transformative, because unlike control, it doesn't protect you from suffering. It delivers you to what actually matters. And to suffer with meaning, to live with coherence, to inhabit your center, is what you've been seeking all along. You just didn't know the price, to give up certainty in order to live in wholeness. You've seen this script 1,000 times. An ordinary character lives a quiet routine until he's called to an adventure. He resists, he's afraid, but something forces him to go. Along the way, he faces monsters, loses allies, nearly dies, until he discovers an inner power he never knew he had. He returns home, transformed. This is the structure of the hero's journey, identified by Joseph Campbell. But what few realize is that this myth isn't just for books and films. According to Jung, it's a mirror of the psychic journey we are all silently living within ourselves. You are that hero, even if no one sees it. Even if you feel fragile, lost, small. Even if your battles aren't against dragons, but against insecurities, addictions, guilt, trauma. The archetypal journey happens inside. And purpose isn't the final prize. It's the path itself. It's what is born in you at each step faced, each shadow integrated, each truth heard. The call doesn't come with trumpets, it comes with crisis. The departure isn't geographical, it's emotional. The crossing doesn't happen in distant lands, but in the dark corridors of your own soul. The inner hero is summoned when the external life stops making sense. When everything that used to work starts falling apart, when the roles you used to play no longer fit. That is the call. And like in the myths, the first reaction is always refusal. You say you can't, that it's not the time, that you're too tired. But the call persists. It shows up in dreams, in synchronicities, in collapses. And there comes a moment when resisting hurts more than going. That's when you depart, not with bags, but with questions. The first phase is the confrontation with the shadow. The monster isn't outside, it's within. It's your suppressed anger, your hidden shame, your fear of being who you truly are. You try to defeat it, but it won't die. Then you learn that the battle isn't to win, it's to integrate. And what seemed like an enemy is part of you. Then comes the desert, the solitude, the loss of reference points. The dark night of the soul. Here you are no longer who you were, but you still don't know who you are becoming. It is fertile emptiness, the symbolic womb, the moment the ego breaks and the self begins to emerge. Then something shifts. A presence appears, a guide, a force, an intuition, something that is not you, but lives within you. It is the self, the deep center of the psyche, showing that there is meaning in the chaos. And you, now less arrogant, less rushed, start to listen, to follow, to walk with less control and more presence. And little by little you begin to recover lost parts of yourself, your sensitivity, your strength, your truth, your soul. The return is the final and hardest phase, because you come back to the world you knew, but you are no longer the same. And now you must live with integrity what you discovered. Uphold your truth even if no one understands. Act with courage even when it hurts. Love without hiding. Work with presence. Inhabit your body. Carry your purpose. Because the inner journey is only complete when it manifests in the world. When your silent transformation becomes offering. You don't need to live an epic adventure. Your life already is one. The pain you hide is your dragon. The past you avoid is the cave. The intuition you suppress is the map. Purpose is not a trophy you win. It is the way you walk, with wholeness, with truth, with surrender, with presence. The soul doesn't want you to get there. It wants you to cross here, with awareness, Jung saw in the hero's journey not a plot, but a psychic map, a deep model of the soul in motion, and if you have the courage to recognize it, you'll realize you're already on the path, that you've already been called, that you're already crossing, and that everything you need, strength, clarity, meaning, isn't out there. It's within you, waiting to be lived. You want change, you want purpose, you want clarity, you want to feel that life has direction, but you want all of this without giving up what you've built so far. You want to grow without breaking. You want to transform without shedding. You want to evolve while keeping the ego, the roles, the relationships, the structures intact. And that is exactly where the soul confronts you with its most brutal demand. True purpose requires the symbolic death of your old self. There is no way to carry a new life while wearing the identity of the past. There is no way to be born whole without first dying in parts. Jung knew this, like few others. He said that real transformation does not come through willpower. It comes through collapse, through loss, through rupture, through the crumbling of the image you spent years building. The soul isn't interested in preserving your persona. It wants you to become real. And for that to happen, what is false must fall. What is inherited must be returned. What is a mask must be removed. Not by force, but by truth. Because as long as you try to preserve everything you built on the outside, there will be no space for what needs to emerge from within. This symbolic death is terrifying. It feels like failure, like losing control, like disorientation. In fact, it's all of that, and more. It's as if you were going through an internal earthquake. Everything that gave you security starts to collapse, certainties vanish, relationships shake, faith wavers. What once was clear now feels strange, and you find yourself staring into the abyss. The temptation is to retreat, to glue the pieces back together, to reinforce what's broken, to return to the familiar. But the soul, patient and unwavering, keeps saying, move forward. Atin, because only in this emptying can purpose appear. Before that, it would just be another layer of the ego, another fantasy of greatness, another attempt to control. True purpose is not imposed upon the old self. It is born from what remains when the old self dissolves. And what remains at first seems small, but it is pure, authentic, alive, like the seed after the pruning, silent, fragile, but real, and everything that is real grows. This phase of the path is the loneliest, because no one can die for you, no one can cross this void in your place. It is a silent mourning, not for someone who has died, but for someone you can no longer continue to be. The pain of that renunciation is immense, but the freedom that comes after is even greater, because when you stop sustaining the old, you begin to hear the new. A new self, a new rhythm, a new gaze, a new life, not better, not more beautiful, but more true. Jung affirmed that individuation begins when the ego surrenders to the self. And surrender is never passive, it is an act of courage. It's saying, I don't know who I will become, but I know I can no longer be who I was. It's stepping through the portal without guarantees. It's walking in the dark with trust. It's letting go of the image for the sake of the calling. And this calling doesn't scream, it whispers. It emerges in dreams, in intuitions, in solitary tears. It manifests when everything outside seems silent, but inside something pulses, and that pulse is life trying to be born through your voice. Most people don't go through this process. Most retreat, return to the familiar, settle back into the old identity, and live their lives feeling that something's missing. But those who go through it are reborn, and they never go back to what they were, because they know that what they used to call me was only a cocoon. And what emerged from that cocoon now has wings. There is no purpose without loss, without grief, without detachment. But what comes after symbolic death is what you've been searching for all along. Only now, it's no longer a dream. It's you, whole, present, alive. You grew up hearing that purpose is synonymous with fulfillment, that finding your mission is like discovering a source of endless happiness. That once you're aligned with your why, everything flows, everything works, everything shines. But this is one of the greatest illusions of the self-help era, because in Carl Jung's profound vision, true purpose does not bring comfort. It brings responsibility. It's not light, it's heavy. And it doesn't make you happy all the time. It makes you whole. Because while happiness is an emotional state, purpose is a calling from the soul. And whoever answers that call knows there will be a price. True purpose is not pleasure, it is meaningful weight, a symbolic cross, a mission you didn't rationally choose, but that chose you entirely. It is something you carry not because it's easy, but because not carrying it would kill you inside. And that changes everything, because now you understand why you feel so tired, why you feel so uncertain, why you feel afraid. Because all of this is part of the passage for those trying to live with coherence, not convenience. Modern society idolizes lightness. Everything has to be fast, effortless, entertaining. Everything must keep you motivated, inspired, energized. But the path of purpose, in Jungian terms, passes through gateways that are anything but comfortable. Through shadow, through doubt, through solitude, through silence, through the collapse of the structures that once supported you. And only then, do you begin to feel the warmth of truth, not as ecstasy, but as root, as ground, as a quiet certainty that despite the pain, you are exactly where you need to be. Jung never promised happiness. He promised wholeness. He said that suffering, when lived with awareness, is not punishment. It is transition. It is the symbolic frame around the birth of the self. And it is in this process that purpose begins to emerge, not like an explosion, but like a burning ember, an ember that warms, that guides, that transforms, but that also demands. Because now you carry something inside you that is greater than your personal desires, something that can no longer be ignored. That's why so many give up, because they expected a calling that would place them on a stage. But the true calling places you on an inner altar, and it demands silence, and it demands sacrifice, and it demands presence. Purpose is not a platform for visibility, it is an existential offering. And often, it calls you to places no one sees, to roles the world does not recognize, to battles that no one applauds, but that within you make everything finally make sense. You may be living this paradox now. You discovered what moves you, but realized it doesn't bring the happiness you imagined. And that may seem like a mistake, but it's actually alignment. Because now you understand, you're not here to be happy all the time. You're here to live in truth. And that includes pain, includes conflict, includes fear, but also includes power, wholeness, meaning, an internal strength that no longer depends on the external. Because now you're no longer chasing approval, you're responding to a call. And you know what happens when you accept this weight? You stop running, you stop sabotaging yourself, you stop negotiating with your soul, and you begin to live with a depth few ever touch. A depth that doesn't fit in motivational quotes, but that fills the void nothing else can. And then, one day you wake up, tired maybe, but whole, knowing that your pain is not useless, that your effort is not vanity, that your story, and with all its falls, is the fertile ground for something greater. Carl Jung never said that finding your purpose would feel good. He said it would make you become who you truly are. And that alone is worth the wait. You want to change. You want to find your purpose. You want to be whole. but secretly you still wish that everyone would come with you, that your friends understand, that your family supports you, that your partner walks beside you, that the world validates your journey. And then, when you begin walking toward your truth, you realize something no one warned you about. The journey is solitary, brutally solitary. Mut. And not because there's something wrong with you, but because there's something profoundly right. Because when you begin walking alongside your soul, you will inevitably drift away from everything built on lies, fear, or emotional dependence. Jung knew this. He called it the desert phase, the moment when the old world no longer sustains you, and the new one has yet to appear. You feel as if you've lost the language of the people around you. Conversations that once made sense now sound hollow. Ambitions that once drove you now feel empty. People with whom you once shared everything no longer recognize you. And solitude, once avoided, now meets you face to face. Without disguise, without distraction, without a safety net. But this solitude is not punishment, it is preparation. It's the symbolic moment when the soul isolates you, so that you stop explaining yourself. Stop asking for permission. Stop molding yourself to others' expectations, because purpose demands a total reconstruction of identity. And this rebuilding cannot happen amid noise, nor under the judging eyes of others. It needs space, silence, emptiness. It needs you to see yourself, not as others see you, but as you are, when you're no longer trying to please anyone. And yes, it hurts. Solitude hurts like withdrawal from a drug. You'll miss things that no longer serve you. You'll want to go back to the familiar, even knowing it makes you sick. You'll doubt the path. You'll feel strange, misplaced, misunderstood. You'll think you're wrong, but you're not. You're simply returning to yourself. And this return, for a time, won't be shared, because the inner space opening up inside you has no words yet. It cannot be explained, only felt. Jung affirmed that individuation is a radically personal process, and every real journey begins with separation. Not in the sense of cutting ties with hatred or resentment, but in the sense of reclaiming the energy you once gave to the world and bringing it back to yourself. Because before you can give yourself fully, you must inhabit yourself completely. Before guiding others, you must become your own guide, and that only happens when you can stand to be alone, when you learn to listen to yourself, to sustain yourself, to be your own companion. And something powerful begins to happen in this symbolic exile. You discover you're not as alone as you thought, because in the silence of solitude, the soul speaks, the self appears, intuition blooms. The false layers begin to fall away, and what once felt like absence becomes presence, a presence that doesn't depend on anyone, that doesn't need an audience, that doesn't beg for belonging, a presence that is yours and therefore sacred. After crossing through that solitude, you don't come back the same. You return with grounding, with clarity, with a silent strength that doesn't scream, but that no one can ignore. Because now you're no longer trying to fit in. You're too busy being whole, and that changes everything. Relationships shift, choices shift, words shift, because now the one speaking for you is your truth. And then, ironically, solitude disappears. Because now you no longer need own company, you choose it. And when you choose, you attract what resonates. You find people walking the same path, people who don't want applause, they want truth, people who recognize in you what they also carry, a soul in motion. Carl Jung understood. The price of wholeness is temporary solitude, but what comes afterward is a kind of love that cannot be bought, sold, or begged for. It's the love that happens when you find yourself. You grew up believing that your gender defines who you are, that men are reason and action, that women are emotion and sensitivity, that there are fixed roles, predefined functions, opposing natures. But Carl Jung with his deep and symbolic vision of the psyche, broke through this shallow duality and revealed something far more powerful. Within every human being exists both a psychic feminine and masculine, and true purpose can only emerge when these two poles stop fighting and start dancing. Jung called these inner forces anima, the feminine in men, and animus, the masculine in women. But make no mistake, he wasn't speaking of gender, but of symbolic energy, of living archetypes. The anima represents the internal, intuitive, sensitive, receptive, emotional world. She connects men to their soul, to emotion, to art, to depth. The animus, in turn, symbolizes reason, discernment, direction, assertiveness. He gives women access to their expressive power, decision-making, and vision. When these forces are imbalanced, the human being lives in conflict. But when integrated, they become whole. Maybe you're a man who learned to repress tears, affection, vulnerability. And now, even though you're strong, you feel empty. Maybe you're a woman who learned to silence her anger, to depend, to adapt. And now, even though you're loving, you feel powerless. These symptoms are signs that you're not living with all sides of your soul. You're fragmented, distorted by social roles that crushed your inner truth. And as long as these poles remain unacknowledged and unintegrated, your purpose will remain blocked. Because it doesn't arise from the masculine or the feminine, it arises from the asymbolic union of both. Ndishum. The ego loves dichotomies, masculine versus feminine, strength versus sensitivity, logic versus intuition. But the soul does not recognize these borders. It is totality. An individuation, for Jung, is the path in which the man must descend into his anima, and the woman must rise into her animus. It's an internal, silent, revolutionary movement. And this meeting is not romantic. It is initiatory. It is the inner marriage. The moment when you no longer depend on someone else to feel whole. Because now you carry fed both halves, those of your being within. When a man ignores his anima, he becomes rigid, dry, superficial. He seeks women not for connection, but for projection. He idolizes or devalues because he does not recognize in them the mirror of his own wounded feminine. When a woman ignores her animus, she becomes insecure, confused, trapped in fantasy. She seeks men not for partnership, but for salvation. She idealizes or submits because she hasn't yet awakened her inner strength. Everything you project onto others is a part of yourself not yet lived. And this applies to love, to pain, and to your very path. Integrating these poles is more than a psychological task. It is a sacred act, because it is precisely in that point of internal balance that purpose becomes clear. Now, you are no longer being dragged by one side dominating the other. You are navigating with both. The feminine shows you what to feel. The masculine gives you direction to act. The feminine receives. The masculine structures. The feminine reveals. The masculine manifests. And your purpose becomes body, gesture, presence. Jung said that no one becomes whole by simply being a man or a woman. You must live your internal polarities. You must listen to your opposite. You must step out of gender caricature and into symbolic wholeness. Because only then do you stop seeking in the world what you lack and begin offering the world what you've found. And that changes everything. Your relationships, your work, your expression. Because now you are in union with yourself. In the end, purpose is not a destination. It is a state. And that state begins when your masculine and your feminine cease being enemies and become allies. You meet someone and, without knowing why, feel an almost magnetic admiration. Or on the contrary, an immediate, irrational, uncontrollable aversion. You try to justify it. That person annoys me. That guy is amazing. She inspires me. He makes me angry. But Carl Jung would give you an answer that dismantles all these superficial explanations. What you feel about others says much more about you than about them. Because every intense emotion that arises in front of someone, be it love, envy, anger, or idolization, is almost always a projection. A reflection of something alive or repressed inside you, something you haven't yet had the courage to integrate. Projection is one of the most fascinating and most unsettling concepts in Jungian psychology. It occurs when you fail to recognize a part of yourself and then see it in the other, the quality you repress or cannot accept in yourself, out of fear, shame, or conditioning, manifests externally either as enchantment or as repulsion. You fall in love with someone who embodies what you haven't dared to live, or you hate someone who expresses, without guilt, what you're still hiding. In both cases, it's not the other person affecting you. It's you seeing yourself for the first time from the outside. Maybe you admire brave people because you haven't embraced your own strength, or you resent vain people because you don't allow yourself to shine. Maybe you fall for free-spirited people because you're chained to expectations, or you criticize those who are too intense because you've learned to numb your emotions. Projection is a symbolic mirror. And for purpose to be born, you must pull back those projections and recognize that everything that moves you in others already lives in you. It's only dormant, denied, deactivated. Jung said, "Know all the theories, master all the techniques. But as you touch a human soul, be just another human soul." And that touch begins when you stop assigning responsibility to others for everything you feel. The shadow isn't only in what you hide, it's also in what you idealize. Because every idealization is the soul's secret request, bring this inward. And every rage is a wound crying out, you still haven't healed this part of yourself. The path to purpose necessarily passes through this mirror. Because as long as you're projecting, you remain fragmented, living outside yourself, desiring or rejecting aspects that are yours, but have yet to be integrated. And integration begins with awareness, with sincere questions. Why does this bother me so much? What is this person awakening in me that destabilizes me? What do I see in them that I haven't yet embraced in myself? These questions don't have easy answers, but they hold enormous transformational power. When you begin reclaiming your projections, something magical happens. You stop judging, you stop idolizing, you stop running, and you begin walking with more truth, with more wholeness. You begin to see others not as threats or saviors, but as keen mirrors. And in doing so, you mature. Because now, instead of seeking outside what you feel you lack, you begin cultivating within what you once abandoned. This movement is essential to the birth of purpose, because you cannot offer the world something you still deny in yourself. You cannot become a vessel for your mission while you remain divided. And every projection you reclaim, every shadow you reintegrate, is a piece of your soul returning home. And the more fragments you bring back, the clearer the path becomes, the meaning, the direction. Projection is a disguised calling. It is the self saying, see, what you so deeply desire is already yours. Or what you so fiercely reject is exactly what you must heal. Jung didn't teach us to run from the mirror, he taught us to enter it. Because only there, in the deep reflection of the other, can the soul finally see itself. You think you're just living an ordinary life. You wake up, work, relate, dream, suffer, repeat. But Jung would reveal something that forever changes the way you see existence. Your life is not random. It's a myth in motion. And as long as you live as if you were just a name on a document, a professional function, or a set of habits, you will remain disconnected from the symbolic greatness that dwells within your path. Because behind every experience, every challenge, every passion, and every pain, there is an archetypal narrative wanting to be lived, an inner legend that only you can write. Jung called this the personal myth. Not as a made-up fantasy, but as a deep symbolic structure, unique, that is encoded in your unconscious. It is your essential script, your existential drama, your unique journey pattern. And it's unique because it was born with you. It's present in your childhood, in your recurring dreams, in your inexplicable fascinations. It shows up in the figures that move you, in the stories you always return to, in the themes that keep resurfacing. And if you listen carefully, you'll notice life is not leading you to a generic destination, it's guiding you toward the symbolic incarnation of your own mythology. This means you're not here just to exist. You're here to live a story with soul, to go through specific challenges that forge your power, to express truths only you can carry, to bring into the world a frequency no one else can replicate. And every time you betray this, by following someone else's path, copying formulas, obeying ready-made scripts, you feel a kind of exhaustion that isn't physical, it's existential. It's your soul saying, "This script is not mine." Joseph Campbell, aligned with Jung, used to say, "Follow your bliss." But that doesn't mean chasing pleasure. It means following the thread of your myth, following what makes sense to you, even if it makes no sense to anyone else. Following what stirs your soul for no logical reason, what calls you with mysterious force, what transforms you, what silences you, what reveals you. Because when you begin living your inner legend, the world stops being just a backdrop and becomes a mirror. Everything begins to respond, not because life gets easier, but because it becomes true. But beware, to live your personal myth, you must break free from normosis, from the addiction to the ordinary, from the prison of what's acceptable. You must learn to say no to paths that work for others but extinguish your light. You must abandon the idea that you need to be understood and commit to something far more important: being yourself, radically, fully, courageously. Because once your personal myth awakens, it can no longer be ignored. It calls you, pressures you, enchants you, until you finally accept you're not here to repeat, you're here to reveal. And how do you write this myth? By living, with presence, with deep listening, with surrender to your inner narrative. Real purpose is not a generic mission, it is your mythology turned into action. It's when your inner symbol takes form in the outer world, when your pain becomes direction, your talent becomes expression, your journey becomes a bridge. You become character, author, and witness of your own legend. And when that happens, your entire life changes color. Carl Jung knew what you seek is not a social role, it's a symbolic one. It's living a story with meaning, leaving a trail of authenticity, embodying your personal myth in every choice, every gesture, every step, because only then you stop merely surviving and begin to exist with soul. You still hope there's a path that doesn't hurt, a journey where fear never shows up, a purpose that costs nothing, a version of yourself that is strong but never vulnerable. That is free but never rejected, that is whole yet always applauded. But Carl Jung brings you back to solid ground, the symbolic soil where the soul truly walks. Purpose is a path marked by pain, by loss, by collapse. But it's also the only place where you feel truly alive, because what wounds you is not the pain itself, it's the disconnection. And when you live in truth, even bleeding, life pulses. You will suffer. Yes, you will. But this suffering is not punishment. It's part of becoming real, because if before you suffered from trying to fit in, from self-sabotage, from wearing masks, now you suffer because you are exposed, stripped down, living without anesthesia. And this kind of pain is something else. It's pain that purifies, pain that draws you closer, pain that has direction. It's the necessary suffering to be reborn, not as some idealized version, but as someone whole, with flaws, with history, with depth. Jung said that no one becomes who they truly are without crossing their own dark night. And this night is made of silence, of solitude, of existential doubts no book can resolve. It's when the soul withdraws, the world pulls away, and all that remains is the confrontation between you and yourself. And it is in that place, at rock bottom, that the self begins to speak. Not with formulas, but with symbols, with sensations, with intuitions. It is there, in the pain you've tried so hard to avoid, that purpose whispers your name for the first time. And what changes when you accept that it's going to hurt? Everything, because now you stop resisting, you stop blaming yourself for feeling, you stop thinking you failed just because you're not always okay. You understand that feeling lost inside is part of deeper orientation, that breaking one identity is the beginning of another. That falling isn't the end, it's the shedding of a shell, the birth of a new gaze, a new relationship with your own soul. The happiness they promised you was shallow. It was a fantasy of endless comfort, shadowless ease, success without sacrifice. But real life isn't like that. Real happiness is shaky, imperfect, intermittent. And real purpose includes sadness. It includes crisis. It includes despair, because it includes all of you, unfiltered, unidealized, uncensored. And that's what brings you back to life. Truthfully, Jung knew that many retreat when pain arrives. They put their masks back on, convince themselves that this soul stuff is nonsense. But those who stay, who cross through it, who can bear the inner burning, come out the other side with eyes that never close again. Because they have seen themselves naked, they have seen their pain, they have seen their power. They have seen that what the world called weakness was exactly where the soul most longed to bloom. You won't live without pain, but you can live with pain and meaning. You can suffer with direction. You can stumble with presence, and that changes everything, because now at every step, even a painful one, you're exactly where you need to be, not because it's easy, but because it's true. And truth is the only thing that holds you when everything else fails. Purpose is not anesthesia. It is surrender. It is commitment. It is a choice to live deeply, even if it costs you tears. Because the tears of a soul in transit are not a sign of weakness, they are baptism. You've spent your whole life searching, read books, took courses, listened to lectures, sought answers in every direction. You tried to improve yourself, overcome trauma, speed up healing, find your mission. You ran in circles, believing purpose was a goal to be achieved through effort. That if you just understood enough, evolved enough, did everything right, you'd get there. But what Carl Jung revealed is the opposite. Purpose doesn't appear when you're chasing it. It comes when you finally stop running. Stopping the search is not giving up. It is surrender. It's accepting that your mind won't be the one to figure out the path. It's realizing that what you've been seeking has been trying to reach you all along. That while you chased an idealized destination, your soul was right there, waiting for you to pause, to listen, to feel, to integrate. Purpose is like a buried seed. Pulling the leaves won't make it grow. You must respect the time of rooting, the time of darkness, the time of silence. While you search in haste, all you find are shallow versions, copied, romanticized. The mind wants answers. The soul wants a journey. And true purpose doesn't arrive as a finished plan, but as a presence that begins to grow within you, discreetly, unexpectedly, when you're no longer trying to be someone, but simply being. When you stop shaping yourself to please, when you let go of control, when you embrace not knowing. It is in that space of surrender that the soul finally breathes, and then it shows up, not as a divine light, not as a detailed plan, but as an internal feeling of coherence, as a simple gesture that suddenly makes sense, as a silence filled with meaning, as an action that makes you forget time, as a moment where you feel at home within yourself. That is purpose, and it cannot be explained. It can only be recognized. felt, lived. Jung said a meaningful life isn't one you understand, it's one you choose to inhabit. And that acceptance only becomes possible when you stop seeking compulsively, when you understand that the path isn't out there. It's in every breath taken with presence, in every step made with truth, in every choice that says, I don't know what comes next, but I know I can't betray myself anymore. Then, something changes. Despair gives way to serenity. Doubt gives space to listening. Confusion dissolves into trust. Because now, you're no longer trying to force a direction. You're flowing with a center, an invisible thread that links every detail of your story, every pain, every turning point, every fall, every ignored intuition, all of it. Everything you've lived was part of a bigger pattern, one that can only be seen when you stop running and look with your soul. Purpose is not something you discover. It reveals itself. When you're whole enough to hold it, when you stop chasing the extraordinary and start living the essential, when you understand that there's no final answer, only total presence. And in the end, what you were searching for all along was yourself, awakened, truthful, available. Carl Jung knew the soul doesn't scream, it whispers, and only those who stop looking with their eyes can hear with the heart.